Richard Blackwell thought he knew everything about his son's bride, until the bride's mother appeared in the corridor. Victoria Summers was the woman whose marriage proposal he had rejected and removed from his life 25 years ago, and now their families would be forever connected. Richard Blackwell stood in the magnificent ballroom of the St. Regis Hotel, overseeing the final preparations for his son James's wedding ceremony. The 60-year-old billionaire businessman, founder and CEO of Blackwell Enterprises, was accustomed to controlling every detail in his life, and his son's wedding was no exception. 300 guests, the finest catering company, a celebrity wedding planner, and perfect floral arrangements, everything had been prepared to meet his exacting standards. The love story between James and his fiancée Emma filled Richard with pride. They had met at Harvard, both distinguished as successful law students, and had continued their relationship after graduation. Emma was intelligent, beautiful, and came from a good family, exactly the kind of wife Richard wanted for his son. The young woman now worked at a prestigious law firm and possessed a promising career trajectory. Throughout the wedding preparations, Richard had only known Emma's family from a distance. He knew her father was Dr. Michael Summers, a renowned cardiologist, and had heard that her mother was also a successful businesswoman. The families had dined together a few times, but these gatherings were typically formal and brief. Richard had missed most organizational meetings due to business travel, having only brief phone conversations with Emma's mother, Victoria. Tonight was different. Richard's former wife, Margaret, had passed away from cancer 3 years earlier, and this wedding symbolized James's transition into a new phase of life. Richard looked forward to witnessing his son's happiness, while also deeply feeling the loneliness in his own life. After Margaret's death, he had buried himself even deeper in the business world, almost completely neglecting his social life. As the wedding coordinator discussed last-minute changes with Richard, a figure appearing at the end of the corridor caught his attention. A tall, elegant woman wore an emerald green dress, her hair arranged in a sophisticated chignon. The woman walked with confidence, graciously greeting people around her. Richard's heart momentarily stopped, because that walk, that posture, that profile was familiar. Victoria Summers stood 50 feet away, moving through the hotel corridor with the poise of someone completely comfortable in high society settings. She was more beautiful than Richard remembered, her skin glowing with health and confidence, her bearing suggesting success and self-assurance that hadn't been there 25 years ago. The young woman he had once known had transformed into a formidable presence who commanded respect simply by walking into a room. Her recognition hit Richard like a physical blow, memories flooding back with painful clarity. Victoria Martinez, as she had been known then, was the daughter of a middle-class Mexican immigrant family, working her way through business school while supporting her younger siblings. Richard had met her during his final year at Wharton, when she was a graduate student studying for her MBA while working part-time at the university library. Their relationship had been passionate and tumultuous, a collision between Richard's privileged background and Victoria's determined climb from modest circumstances. For 18 months, they had navigated the complex dynamics of different social classes, different expectations, and different definitions of success. Victoria had challenged Richard in ways that both thrilled and terrified him, pushing him to question assumptions about worth and value that his family had instilled since childhood. The Blackwell family had not approved of Victoria. Richard's father, the original founder of Blackwell Enterprises, had made his position clear through subtle but unmistakable pressure. Victoria was not the kind of woman who would enhance the family's social standing or business connections. She lacked the proper background, the right connections, and the inherited wealth that would complement Richard's eventual inheritance of the family empire. The pressure had intensified as Richard's graduation approached and discussions of marriage became more serious. Victoria had never explicitly demanded a proposal, but her expectations were clear, and Richard found himself torn between genuine love for her and loyalty to family expectations that had shaped his entire identity. The conflict had consumed him for months, creating tension that neither of them could ignore. The final confrontation had occurred at a family dinner where Victoria had been invited to meet Richard's parents and extended family. The evening had been a disaster of subtle slights, condescending questions about her background, and barely concealed disapproval of her presence among people who measured worth by ancestry and bank accounts rather than character or achievement. Victoria had handled the evening with grace and dignity that impressed even Richard's harshest critics. But the message had been clear. She would never be accepted, never be considered suitable, never be welcomed into the Blackwell family as anything more than a temporary distraction from Richard's eventual obligation to marry someone more appropriate to his station. Richard had chosen family loyalty over love, duty over desire, security over risk. He had ended their relationship with cold finality, explaining to Victoria that their different backgrounds made marriage impossible, that his responsibilities to the family business required a wife who could navigate high society with inherited ease rather than learned competence. Victoria had listened to his carefully rehearsed speech with growing devastation, watching the man she loved choose social approval over their shared future. She had asked only one question before leaving his life forever, whether he truly believed that love was less important than others' approval. Richard's inability to answer had told her everything she needed to know. Now, 25 years later, Victoria Summers moved through the St. Regis Hotel with the confidence of someone who had not only survived Richard's rejection, but had thrived beyond anything he might have imagined. Her success was evident in every detail, from her designer dress to her perfectly styled hair, to the way other guests deferred to her presence. Richard watched in growing amazement as Victoria greeted other wedding guests with warmth and familiarity, clearly comfortable in social situations that would have intimidated the young graduate student he had once known. She had not only achieved the success she had dreamed of, but had apparently done so while maintaining the authenticity and warmth that had first attracted him to her. The wedding coordinator was still speaking, but Richard's attention was entirely focused on the woman whose life he had once dismissed as incompatible with his own. Victoria was laughing at something another guest had said, and the sound carried across the corridor with the same musical quality that had once made Richard's heart race. Time had refined her beauty rather than diminished it, adding depth and character to features that had already been striking. As if sensing his gaze, Victoria looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded space. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by emotions Richard couldn't quite read. Surprise, certainly, but also something that might have been resignation or perhaps simple acknowledgement of an inevitable encounter they had both known would eventually occur. Victoria excused herself from her conversation and began walking toward Richard with the same determined stride he remembered from their university days. She moved with purpose but without apparent anxiety, suggesting that unlike Richard, she had prepared herself for this moment and made peace with whatever emotions it might trigger. Richard found himself unable to move as Victoria approached, his mind racing through potential conversations and explanations, while his heart pounded with the force of memories he had spent decades suppressing. The successful businessman who negotiated multi-million-dollar deals without visible stress felt completely unprepared for a simple conversation with a woman he had once loved and lost through his own choices. Victoria stopped 3 feet away from Richard, maintaining appropriate social distance while studying his face with eyes that seemed to catalog the changes 25 years had brought to his appearance. Her expression was composed but not cold, professional but not entirely impersonal. She had clearly learned to navigate complex social situations with skill that served her well in this unexpected encounter. The greeting that followed was perfectly polite, exchanged between the father of the groom and the mother of the bride who were meeting for the first time. Victoria's voice carried no trace of their shared history, no indication that Richard had once been the most important person in her world before becoming the source of her greatest heartbreak. Richard listened to Victoria's calm discussion of wedding logistics and family introductions, noting that she spoke with the confidence of someone who had achieved significant professional success. She mentioned her consulting firm specializing in international business development, her work with companies expanding into Latin American markets, and her pride in Emma's accomplishments with the natural ease of someone comfortable discussing her achievements. The irony was not lost on Richard that Victoria had built exactly the kind of successful business career that his family had once claimed was impossible for someone from her background. She had not only proven their prejudices wrong, but had exceeded the professional accomplishments of many people who had enjoyed inherited advantages she had never possessed. As their conversation continued, other guests began approaching to meet Richard or speak with Victoria, creating a complex social dynamic that required both of them to maintain polite facades while processing the emotional implications of their unexpected reunion. Victoria handled these interactions with practiced ease, introducing Richard to people who clearly respected and admired her without revealing any personal history that might complicate the evening's festivities. Richard learned that Victoria had married Dr. Summers 10 years after their relationship ended, building a partnership that had produced not only Emma, but also successful careers for both spouses. Her husband was apparently traveling and would arrive just before the ceremony, having been delayed by a medical emergency that required his expertise. The revelation that Victoria had waited 10 years before marrying suggested that their breakup had affected her more deeply than her current composure indicated. Richard found himself wondering whether she had needed that time to heal from their relationship or whether she had simply been focused on building her career before considering marriage and family. Emma appeared at Victoria's side, radiant in her pre-ceremony preparations and eager to introduce her mother to additional guests. The young woman's obvious love and respect for Victoria was evident in every interaction, suggesting a close mother-daughter relationship built on mutual admiration and support. Richard studied Emma with new attention, looking for traces of Victoria in her daughter's features and mannerisms. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, particularly in the way Emma tilted her head when listening and the graceful way she moved through social situations. Victoria had clearly passed on not only her intelligence and determination, but also her ability to navigate complex social environments with authentic warmth. The wedding ceremony began with guests taking their assigned seats in the beautifully decorated ballroom. Richard found himself seated at the front as father of the groom, while Victoria took her place across the aisle as mother of the bride. The positioning meant they would spend the next hour acutely aware of each other's presence while focusing on their children's happiness. James looked handsome and confident as he waited at the altar, clearly nervous but excited about the commitment he was making. Richard felt the familiar surge of paternal pride, knowing that his son had grown into a man of character and integrity despite the privileges that might have corrupted someone with weaker values. When Emma appeared at the back of the ballroom, radiant in her wedding dress, Richard felt a complex mixture of emotions. She was beautiful and glowing with happiness, but seeing her also meant acknowledging Victoria's success as a mother and the life she had built after their relationship ended. Emma was living proof that Victoria had not only survived Richard's rejection, but had created something beautiful and meaningful beyond it. The ceremony proceeded with traditional elegance, the bride and groom exchanging vows that spoke of love, commitment, and shared dreams for the future. Richard listened to their promises with emotions that went deeper than typical parental pride, recognizing in their words the kind of commitment he had once been too frightened or too proud to make. During the exchange of rings, Richard found his gaze drifting to Victoria, watching her face as she witnessed her daughter's marriage. Victoria's expression was radiant with maternal joy, but Richard thought he detected moments of deeper reflection, perhaps remembering her own wedding or thinking about the different paths their lives had taken. The reception that followed the ceremony was a masterpiece of elegant entertaining, with guests moving seamlessly between cocktails, dinner, and dancing in spaces decorated with sophisticated taste. Richard moved through the evening, fulfilling his obligations as father of the groom, giving toasts, greeting guests, and ensuring that everything proceeded according to plan. Victoria was equally busy with her own responsibilities as mother of the bride, but Richard found himself constantly aware of her presence across the room. She was clearly popular among the wedding guests, many of whom seemed to know her personally or professionally. Her success in building relationships was evident in the way people sought her out for conversation and consultation. During dinner, Richard learned more about Victoria's life through conversations with other guests who spoke admiringly of her business acumen and community involvement. She had apparently built her consulting firm into a significant success, employing dozens of people and working with major corporations seeking to expand into international markets. The dinner toasts provided Richard with his first clear view of Victoria's current happiness and satisfaction with her life choices. Dr. Summers had arrived just before the ceremony, and his toast to the bride revealed genuine affection for his stepdaughter and deep love for his wife. Victoria's response was gracious and warm, acknowledging the family they had built together and the joy Emma had brought to their lives. Richard's own toast focused on James's character and accomplishments, his pride in the man his son had become, and his confidence in the marriage James and Emma were beginning. He avoided any references to his own romantic history or personal relationships, keeping his remarks focused on the younger generation and their promising future. As the evening progressed and guests began dancing, Richard found himself with increasing opportunities to observe Victoria in social situations that revealed different aspects of her personality and current life. She danced with obvious pleasure, laughed freely at others' jokes, and moved through conversations with the ease of someone genuinely comfortable in her own skin. The contrast between the confident, successful woman before him and the uncertain graduate student he had once known was striking. Victoria had not only achieved professional success, but had developed the social skills and personal confidence that allowed her to navigate any environment with grace and authenticity. During a brief moment when both were alone at the edge of the dance floor, Victoria approached Richard for their first private conversation of the evening. Her manner was friendly but reserved, acknowledging their shared past without dwelling on its complications or disappointments. Victoria spoke easily about Emma's childhood and education, her pride in her daughter's accomplishments, and her gratitude for the happiness James had brought into Emma's life. She asked polite questions about Richard's business and expressed condolences about Margaret's death with sincere sympathy that suggested she held no resentment about his marriage or family life. The conversation was perfectly appropriate for the occasion, but Richard found himself searching Victoria's face for signs of the woman he had once known and loved. The passion and intensity that had characterized their relationship seemed to have been replaced by serenity and self-possession that spoke of hard-won wisdom and emotional maturity. Richard realized that Victoria had become everything he had once feared she could never be in his world, not through changing herself to fit others' expectations, but by building her own world where authenticity and achievement mattered more than ancestry and inherited privilege. She had proven that his family's concerns about her suitability had been based on prejudice rather than insight. As the evening drew toward its close, Richard found himself reluctant to end what might be his only opportunity to speak privately with Victoria. Their children's marriage meant they would be connected for life, but future interactions would be mediated by family obligations rather than personal choice. Victoria seemed to sense his thoughts, mentioning that she and Dr. Summers lived in Chicago, where her business was headquartered, while Richard remained based in New York. Their paths would likely cross only during family celebrations and holiday gatherings centered on James and Emma's life together. The wedding concluded with the traditional send-off as James and Emma departed for their honeymoon, surrounded by the love and best wishes of family and friends. Richard watched his son's happiness with deep satisfaction, knowing that James had found the kind of partnership that had eluded Richard throughout his own life. As guests began leaving, Richard found himself among the last to depart, reluctant to end an evening that had brought unexpected revelations about paths not taken and choices that had shaped his entire adult life. Victoria was also among the final guests, ensuring that all details were properly concluded and that Emma's belongings were safely packed for the honeymoon trip. Their final exchange was brief but significant, an acknowledgement that they would be part of each other's extended family for the rest of their lives through their children's marriage. Victoria was gracious but distant, making it clear that while she bore no ill will toward Richard, she had no interest in revisiting their past relationship or exploring what might have been different. Richard left the St. Regis Hotel that night, with conflicting emotions about what the evening had revealed. Seeing Victoria again had forced him to confront the magnitude of what he had lost through his own fears and limitations, but it had also shown him that she had built a life of meaning and happiness that didn't require his presence or validation. The weeks following the wedding brought periodic reminders of Victoria's permanent presence in Richard's extended family. Thank you notes from the wedding mentioned her graciousness. Business associates commented on her impressive reputation, and James spoke frequently about his positive relationship with his new mother-in-law. Richard began paying closer attention to news about Victoria's consulting firm, discovering that she had built a business empire that rivaled his own in terms of innovation and international reach. Her success had been achieved through strategic thinking and relationship building that demonstrated the intelligence and determination he had once recognized but failed to support. The realization that Victoria had become exactly the kind of successful, sophisticated woman his family had claimed she could never be forced Richard to confront the prejudices and fears that had shaped his life choices. He had sacrificed love for social approval, authentic connection for inherited expectation, and personal happiness for family loyalty that had ultimately proven meaningless. 6 months after the wedding, Richard attended James and Emma's first dinner party as a married couple, knowing that Victoria and Dr. Summers would also be present. The evening proceeded smoothly, with both sets of parents maintaining friendly but formal relationships that served the young couple's happiness without requiring personal intimacy. Richard watched Victoria throughout the evening, noting her obvious contentment with her marriage and her genuine pleasure in watching Emma's happiness with James. She had clearly found the love and partnership that Richard had once been too afraid to offer, building a relationship based on mutual respect and shared values rather than social expectations or family pressure. The dinner conversation revealed that Victoria and Dr. Summers were planning early retirement to focus on travel and volunteer work, having achieved financial security through their respective careers and wise investments. Their plans included extended trips to Latin America, where Victoria's business had strong connections and where they hoped to contribute to educational and medical initiatives. Richard realized that Victoria had not only built professional success, but had created the kind of meaningful life that integrated personal fulfillment with social contribution. She had achieved everything he had once claimed required sacrificing love and family relationships, proving that his choices had been based on false assumptions about what constituted a worthwhile life. As Richard returned to his empty penthouse that night, he found himself confronting the loneliness that had characterized his life since Margaret's death, and arguably even before. The business empire he had built provided financial security and professional recognition, but it offered no comfort during moments of personal reflection or connection during times of emotional need. The contrast between his own isolation and Victoria's obvious happiness with Dr. Summers forced Richard to acknowledge that his definition of success had been fundamentally flawed. He had achieved wealth and power while sacrificing the relationships that might have given his life meaning and purpose beyond material accumulation. Victoria's presence in his extended family served as a constant reminder of the choice he had made 25 years earlier and its long-term consequences. She had not only survived his rejection, but had flourished beyond anything he might have imagined, while he had gained financial success at the cost of personal fulfillment and authentic connection. The wedding that had reunited them had also revealed the full scope of what Richard had lost through his inability to choose love over social expectation. Victoria Summers had become everything he had once feared she could never be, not by changing herself to meet others' standards, but by creating her own standards based on character, achievement, and authentic relationships. Richard understood that while their children's marriage would keep Victoria in his life indefinitely, the possibility of recapturing what they had once shared was gone forever. She had moved beyond their past relationship to build something better with someone who had recognized her worth from the beginning, while Richard remained alone with the consequences of choices he could never unmake. The billionaire who had everything money could buy had discovered that the most valuable things in life, love, partnership, and authentic connection, were the only treasures that his wealth could not purchase and his past decisions had made impossible to reclaim.